Good morning, class. I'm going to be talking about the first principles of logic. And the section I'm going to be referring to is in Chapter 1, and a little subdivision within Chapter 1 is called the first principles. What are we talking about? Well, Aristotle, in his classic work called the Organon, which is a Latin name, but a Latin philosophers got a hold of his Greek translation, and they named it the Organon, literally meaning the instrument. It's kind of interesting. Aristotle's book is called The Instrument because, in a sense, logic is not a field of study. It is an instrument by which other fields of study can be investigated. In other words, it's like a flashlight. It's like a tool. It's like a pair of pliers or a screwdriver. You use the instrument to apply to arguments. That's why he called it the Organon. So Aristotle came up with a very interesting title for his book, the Organon. So he's talking about the first principles, and there are three first principles. And we have to kind of put them in the context of what Aristotle is trying to do, because back in Aristotle's day and much earlier, even in the time of Socrates, maybe 150 years earlier in Greece, this is earlier than Aristotle, Socrates had already encountered a group of philosophers in the Greek world, many of whom lived in Athens, but outside of Athens as well. There was a group of philosophers called the Sophists. Sophists. In Greek, the word sophos means wisdom. So there was a group of teachers. You might liken them to people who do TED Talks. In other words, they're public intellectuals who make a living finding people who will pay for their resources. So many people in ancient Greece and in the ancient world could not pay for an education. But let's say your family had enough money, you could hire a sophist, you could hire a teacher to teach you the latest theories in geometry or in political science or in astronomy or in music or any of those early fields of study, rhetoric, public speech making, in other words. And you could get somebody to come in, be your private tutor. He might even tutor members of your family. And it would be like a piano teacher coming over or a Kumon teacher coming over to your house, or you might meet with them in public somewhere, and they would be your tutor to train you in the latest educational theories at the time, usually in mathematics or in astronomy, philosophy. There was even architecture and things like that that they knew as well, rhetoric. So anyway, these group of traveling philosophers were called sophists, and they had an interesting theory because they held the idea that nothing was absolutely true. There was no such thing as absolute truth. Truth, for the sophists, was a relative thing. In other words, I might be speaking to you, another person might be speaking in return, two people in a conversation, but people don't really exchange truth with each other. They exchange opinions. Sophists don't believe that human beings ever can get to the heart of reality, to the heart of objective truth, because nothing is ever truthful. The things we believe about chemistry and biology today are going to be supplanted by later discoveries in another 20, 25 years. Scientists in the future will probably be looking at the chemistry that we have in 2020 and will be calling us primitive because things will have developed. We'll learn more about nanotechnology. We have instruments that allow us to see subatomic particles perhaps more clearly. And the science and the quantum physics or anything that we have in chemistry or math will be supplanted by other ideas. That's what the sophists believe. At no time in human history do human beings ever have the truth. At no time in human history. There's no such thing as truth. We have the latest set of opinions in biology and in chemistry and anthropology and sociology and philosophy, the latest opinions, but there is no such thing as truth. And certainly in the field of ethics, right and wrong, there's no such thing as objective truth when you're discussing a matter like right and wrong. So that was a group of very sophisticated philosophers in ancient Greece, certainly in ancient Athens, Socrates knew of them. He used to debate with many sophists because Socrates believed that there were things that we could know and speak truthfully about. He really believed that there were objective definitions of things that made them eternally true. Socrates believed that there was objective truth. He was always searching for it, perhaps never quite finding it, but he believed that it existed. The sophists believed, hey man, we never have the absolute definitions of things, the absolute knowledge and certitude of things. We just don't have it. Aristotle encountered this kind of thinking, and he also, just like Socrates, was concerned that philosophy and learning would completely collapse into relativism if it was not addressed. In other words, Aristotle wanted to apply his mind to coming up with philosophical statements that would stand the test of time, things that would be certain and true. So Aristotle, understanding that there was a group of philosophers, not only in Socrates' day, but even in his own day, he understood that there were people who said that there was no possibility of truth, relativists, you could call them, or subjectivists. That's another word for people who are sophists. In other words, there's no such thing as truth. It's all relative. So Aristotle wanted to address that, and he came up with the 3 first principles. His first principle, and you're going to read this in chapter 1, is something is. That's the first principle of logic. Something is. He called it the principle of being. Because Aristotle said, even if you were debating with a hardcore sophist who said nothing is true, even this conversation you and I are having, there's nothing truthful about it. Aristotle would say, well, the moment for instance, let's just have 2 talking heads together and somebody says, I think this is true. For instance, that unicorns exist. Let's say person A says unicorns exist, and person B says, no, they don't exist. That's just an observation in your mind. Person A could say, well, they exist at least as mental objects, because when you say that they don't exist, what are you saying doesn't exist? In other words, there had to be some object in your mind that existed in order for you to say unicorns don't exist. In other words, how did you get this concept in your mind? There must be concepts. Those exist. In other words, person A would be asking person B, well, if you and I are talking about concepts, how is it that we can be agreeing about the same concept? You must have something in your mind. Something came into your mind and must have been based on some reality or some image. For instance, a unicorn is a horse, a mythological horse with a horn on its head. Well, how did you get that image, person B, if it had not come into your mind in some way, through a drawing or through something that you had heard in a legend or in mythology? So person A is going to stick to the idea that when he says something, this exists, that even when person B says, no, it doesn't, well, person B has to be acknowledging the existence of the thing in order to deny it. So even if it only exists as a concept, it exists. And that's what person A is ultimately trying to say. Things exist. They can be imaginary things. They can be real things. Real is this cup of coffee. Or we could be talking about unicorns or warlocks or witches or goblins. And you might say, well, those things don't exist. They exist as concepts. Notice how most of you would have some concept of a witch or a warlock or a goblin or a unicorn. You have those ideas. How did they get into your head? Because there is a world out here where people talk about mythology and they draw it and stuff like that, and that impacted your brain, and that's why you and I can have a conversation about these things. Something exists as a concept or as a drawing or as a mythology, and you got that into your brain. That's why you're able to say it doesn't exist. Okay, so this is getting kind of wonky, and you can understand how philosophy is not everybody's cup of tea or cup of coffee. But anyway, it's an interesting dialogue, and Aristotle believes that he has come up with a first principle that cannot be denied, the principle of being. And if I can say it a different way, is that if two people are arguing and one person says, it exists, and the other person says, no, it doesn't, the person who says, no, it doesn't, has to have some cognition or some understanding of a thing in order to say that it doesn't exist. So once this person has a concept and that person says, that doesn't exist, they already are showing you that they have a concept. They already have been impacted. Their ears, their eyes, their mind has heard of that concept. Well, how did that come about? If you weren't perceiving something in reality, even if it's only an image, even if it's only a fantasy or a fable, it's still something that you learned about. So Aristotle says, even if in the world we don't know absolutely everything perfectly, we do exist and we do know things, and things make their way into our brain. He calls it the principle of being. Something exists in order for us to be able to deny it. If I deny something, I'm kind of admitting that it exists. And even if it's just a concept, but it exists as a concept. So that's what he means by the principle of being. And if I butchered it, sorry, it's an early attempt in the semester, and I need more of this. Okay, the second principle of being, he called it the principle of identity. You'll see this in chapter 1 in that section called The First Principles of Being by Aristotle. So the second principle of logic is called the principle of identity. Something is what it is. Now that sounds kind of weird, right? Something is what it is. It almost sounds kind of like modern and kind of urban. It is what it is, we say. That's exactly what the language is in the Greek translation. Something is what it is. It's called the principle of identity. And Aristotle here is arguing. He's arguing against the sophists who say nothing is real, nothing is true, we're all making it up. And he's going, no. The principle of identity is that you and I as humans, we tend to come up with language that actually refers to real things. The principle of identity. So when I say coffee, I'm referring to this brown substance that comes from the coffee bean that's brewed, usually hot, and that we serve it in the morning. We usually drink it in the morning or whatever. And it is a beverage. And when I say coffee, the word coffee, in English we could say café in Spanish or whatever other language you want to say or that you know. I'm referring to something real and objective. If I said, let's all get a cup of coffee, most of you wouldn't say, oh, he's inviting me to the gym. No, gym, let's go to the gym. That refers to a different concept. Gym, working out. I said, let's go have a cup of coffee. So I'm referring to this. And Aristotle believes that human beings have come up with language that refers to something that we all agree upon. We all agree that when I say coffee, even from an early age, you've been instructed to realize that I'm referring to a hot, steaming product, usually hot, it can be cold these days, made from the coffee bean, which is usually roasted, okay? Or cold filtered. They have all kinds of, manufacturing processes for coffee nowadays. But anyway, I'm referring to coffee. If I said, look out your window, I'd be referring to the action of looking out your window. If I said, everybody right-click on your mouse, people would, mouse, I'm referring to something. So Aristotle's saying this because sometimes he's saying there is a world of language and human beings over time have come up with an agreement as to what that language is. Although some people, like sophists, will play with the language. They'll say, no, that's not really true. So let me give you an example. Bill Clinton, most of you, even though you know he's a president from the 90s, he's still in the news. He's still always getting himself in trouble on some level. Big Democratic figure, former president, but people are talking about him, having visited Jeffrey Epstein on one of these private islands in the Bahamas, for kinky escapades. Anyway, Bill's always had a notorious reputation with the ladies, it's just a notorious reputation. Anyway, my point is, even back in the 90s, he had gotten in trouble with his sexual behavior. He got involved with a young co-ed, somebody who had been working in Washington as a intern. She had been working in Washington, Monica Lewinsky. It's kind of an old scandal, way before your time, but people still talk about it. Anyway, so Monica Lewinsky, and somehow the story broke that he was involved with a 24-year-old woman and that they were having sex in the White House. Sex in the White House, just something pretty scandalous. Like, dude locked the door to his security people, locked the door. I'm going to, have a sexual encounter here with this young gal. I mean, he must have had people on the outside of the door who knew what was going on. It was pretty strange. Anyway, Bill Clinton acting out. When he got in trouble and he was investigated by Kenneth Starr, a special investigator who was looking into whether he lied about his involvement. In other words, it wasn't that he got involved with somebody. His issue was that he lied about it. And so that's perjury. And perjury is a serious offense, an impeachable offense. But anyway, Bill was saying it never happened. And then later on, I guess in one other testimony, at first he's like, no, I never had sex with that woman. And then later on during that whole proceedings, he goes, well, define sex. Famous statement of his, define sex. And which is a question. Hey, define sex. Define it. And here Bill Clinton was trying to be a clever lawyer or a clever sophist by saying, hey, you and I, we don't even really agree about the definition of sex. And for instance, Bill Clinton could have said, I wasn't really having sex. I was having an interpersonal exchange with this young lady, but sex? It really wasn't sex. What is Bill trying to do? He's trying to do away with this common human agreement that we've all made in the United States, that when we say he was having sex, most people understand what that means, that you were having sex. You weren't creating a website together. You weren't working on campaign strategy with this young intern. No, you were having sex, and most people know that even though there are variations in sex, you were having sex, which means a sexual relationship with this woman. Bill was saying, well, define sex. Almost as if, I don't know what you mean by sex. I know what I mean by sex. And that wasn't sex. Other people try to get clever with this kind of thing too. For instance, when somebody says, the CIA tortured me, or the military, when they were in Syria or in Iran or in Iraq, they captured me, took me to a black site, and they subjected me to water torture, or they beat me, loud music, they tortured me. And of course, military people will say, that wasn't torture. What do you mean by torture? We call that enhanced interrogation, but that certainly wasn't torture. So do you see how there's a tendency with corporations or politicians or the military, for people to play around with language because they're busted, they're usually in trouble, and then they'll say, well, you just don't understand what I mean. So there's a lot of examples of this, and modern day people today refer to this as doublespeak. When a corporation or a politician or the military or some institution uses fancy language to try to whitewash a certain very unpleasant reality. They come up with different language. But Aristotle knew about this tendency for human beings to try to play with language so that they didn't really have to accept the consequences of what they were doing or saying. In other words, Aristotle he's kind of a realist. He believes that when we're saying coffee, we're referring to a certain things. When we're saying mouse, can't really see this, we're referring to a specific object, or keyboard. We're referring to a certain object, or sex, or torture, or when my country invades your country, you can't turn around and do what Adolf Hitler said when the people of Poland saw the Panzer tanks coming into Poland in 1939 and in Czechoslovakia, and in 1939 when the German Wehrmacht, when the German army was marching into Poland and into Czechoslovakia, people were going, we're being invaded. The German tanks were throwing pieces of paper. I don't have a piece of paper, out of the tanks, there were little pieces of paper that was saying, you've been liberated. Notice what the propaganda and the doublespeak was going on back in the late 1930s, because the German army and the Nazi regime was basically trying to say, we're going to come up with our own interpretation of language. The people of Poland knew that when an army comes across your border, that's an invasion. Most people understand invasion means not welcome, not invited. You're invading hostilely into our territory and we don't want you. That's called an invasion. The Germans were saying, invasion? We call it liberation. You've been liberated. You see what that's doing to the mind? Aristotle believes we all have language that we should respect and agree to. Otherwise, we'd never be able to have an argument about anything, because you're coming up with your own interpretations of things, like Bill Clinton was trying to do. He's saying, you're busted for sex, Bill. Define sex. What do you mean by sex? Do you see? The military does it. The German army did it. Your tax accountant will do it when you say, hey, or you're a broker will do it when you say, hey, man, the stock market, I'm losing money. And he'll say, no, you're not losing money. The stock market is adjusting. We're having a market correction. A market correction? You mean it's not losing money? No, the market is just adjusting, bro. It's finding its true level. Well, do you think that when you lose money, you can just simply call it a market correction? No, man, language means language. I lost my money. That means you don't have it anymore. You see how that's real? Anyway, Aristotle even knew back in the day that Greek philosophers would try to play with language. That's why he said the second principle of logic is that language means what it means. And if you can't have that agreement with somebody, if they're just going to play with things and say, oh, I just want language to mean whatever I want it to mean, you can see how difficult it is to have any kind of logical agreement about anything. Okay, I'm talking too much. And the third principle of logic is called the principle of non-contradiction. The principle of non-contradiction. This principle is something cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. Something cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. So I can't have this cup of coffee in my right arm and at the same time not have a cup of coffee in my right arm at the same time. It's impossible to have two different things happening at the same time, because they would contradict each other. Either you have a cup of coffee in your hand or you don't. You can't say I yes and no. No. Now, think about this principle for a minute. Aristotle's trying to create with these first principles kind of like a ring, a canvas, like for instance the octagon where MMA fighting. You know how they put you in the ring, so they say only we have to have whatever combat we're having within the ring. Boxers have the ring as well. Aristotle, I don't know if this image is working for you, but in other words, we have to have these rules where the discussion is going to take place and we have to agree that it's going to happen here. So the first principles are a way for saying if we're going to have logical arguments, we have to agree that we live in a world, that we're in the same world together, and that we're not just in different dimensions and different realities. No, the principle of being, we're all in the world. That's the principle of being. The principle of identity is that language refers to that world, and the principle of non-contradiction means that you can't hold two differing opinions, two completely separate opinions about the same thing at the same time. I can't say I'm living right now and I'm completely dead. No, because now, by the way, I can change the meanings of things. I can say, well, for instance, I can say I'm living, but I feel dead. Okay, that might be true. But notice, in terms of physically living, if I'm physically alive as a human being, I can't at the same time and in the same place and in the same respect be physically dead. It's either one thing or the other. That's the principle of non-contradiction. You can't be pregnant and not pregnant at the same time and in the same respect. If you're pregnant, that means you're not. That means that you're not pregnant. Excuse me, what am I trying to say? If you're pregnant, that means that the opposite of that cannot be true at the same time and the same place. Now, some of you are clever. You can say, well, I'm here listening to the lecture, but I'm not really here. I'm just kind of daydreaming or multitasking. I've got a little, another link open and I'm listening to my music. I ain't really listening to you. So I'm here, but I'm not here. But Aristotle says that's two different respects. If you're physically here listening to this lecture, that means you're physically in the chair at the same time. Mentally, you might not be here, but that's different because Aristotle's principle is something cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. So if we're talking about the physical aspect of you being in a chair listening to this lecture, then you are physically listening to this lecture, and you cannot say at the same time, but I'm at the beach at the same time. No, you could be in the beach in your mind in a different respect, but you can't be physically in the chair listening to this lecture and not physically in the chair listening to the lecture. Those two things would cancel out each other. So those are the first principles of logic. I probably butchered them. Every time I hear myself give this lecture, I was going, oh, this is so atmospheric and kind of, ethereal, kind of removed from, hardcore descriptions of reality. You math people and you science people and you chemistry people and biology people who like the sciences get into a philosophy class and you go, oh my God, this is exactly why I don't like it. It's too abstract. Anyway, but Aristotle's not trying to be abstract. He's trying to keep language. He's trying to keep a discussion happen so that people won't make up stuff, so that we can really have a discussion that really refers to something. And it's kind of like setting up, okay, we're going to have a clean fight. Everybody agree. We have to agree on the language. We have to agree that this is really happening. And we have to agree that you can't say, I got knocked out, but I didn't get knocked out. In other words, you have to agree on things so that you can have some kind of competition or discussion or logic. Okay, that last analogy probably didn't work either, but hey, man, I told you, I need more of this.